In the depths of a Swiss winter night in 1913, a 38-year-old psychiatrist named Carl Gustav Jung experienced what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. Plagued by terrifying visions and on the brink of what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown, Jung made a decision that would forever change our understanding of the human psyche. Instead of running from his inner demons, he chose to descend into them. What he discovered in that descent was not madness, but a profound truth that challenges everything our modern world tells us about death, meaning, and the authentic life. Jung emerged from his dark night of the soul with a radical insight that cuts to the heart of human existence. We do not fear death itself, but the possibility that we might die without ever having truly lived. This is not the sentimental platitude of a greeting card, but a devastating psychological diagnosis of the modern condition. We have constructed elaborate defenses against mortality, built empires of distraction and achievement, created entire cultures devoted to avoiding the one conversation that matters most, the conversation with our own authentic self. The terror that grips us in the small hours of the morning, the anxiety that lurks beneath our daily routines, the depression that no amount of success seems to cure. These are not fear of death, but fear of unlived life. We are haunted not by what will happen when we die, but by what will not have happened while we lived. In our rush to build security, to meet expectations, to fulfill the roles assigned to us by family, society, and our own frightened egos, we have committed the ultimate crime against our own existence. We have become strangers to ourselves. Throughout this exploration, we will excavate Jung's most dangerous insight through 8 profound realizations. First, we will diagnose the 4 ways we murder our own aliveness, through the worship of collective expectations that turns us into hollow performers, through the construction of false personas that become our prisons, through the surrender to what Jung called provisional life, where we postpone authentic living indefinitely, and through the terror of psychological death that keeps us trapped in familiar misery. Then we will uncover the 4 paths to what Jung termed individuation, the heroic journey toward becoming who we truly are, the courage to confront our shadow and reclaim our disowned power, the discipline of active imagination that opens the gateway to our unconscious wisdom, the practice of following what Jung called our daimon, the inner voice that knows our true calling, and finally, the acceptance of what he termed creative suffering, the willingness to be wounded in service of becoming whole. The conventional world tells us that a life well lived is one of comfort, recognition, and the accumulation of external achievements. Jung discovered something far more unsettling, that such a life, no matter how successful by external standards, can be the very definition of death in life. The businessman who climbs every rung of the corporate ladder, but never discovers what truly matters to him, dies 1,000 deaths before his body failed. The parent who sacrifices their deepest dreams to meet social expectations of responsibility kills their soul in service of an illusion of virtue. The artist who creates only what sells, rather than what burns within them, commits suicide by 1,000 small betrayals of their gift. This is what Jung identified as the fundamental pathology of modern existence. We have become experts at living other people's lives while remaining amateurs at living our own. We excel at meeting external demands while failing catastrophically at the one demand that matters: the demand of our own soul for authentic expression. We fear death because we secretly know we have not yet begun to live, and time is running out to discover who we might have been. Jung understood that this terror of unlived life manifests first and most powerfully through our unconscious submission to what he called collective expectations, the invisible prison of social conformity that shapes our choices before we even realize we have choices to make. From the moment we can understand language, we are programmed with scripts about success, happiness, morality, and meaning that have nothing to do with our individual nature and everything to do with social control. These collective expectations operate like a psychological virus, infecting our deepest desires and transforming them into socially acceptable substitutes. The child who dreams of adventure becomes the adult who settles for vacation packages. The young person who yearns to create becomes the professional who rearranges other people's creations. The soul that calls for service becomes the ego that seeks status. We learn to want what we are supposed to want so thoroughly that we forget we ever wanted anything else. This process is so complete, so seamless, that most people live their entire lives without ever realizing they have been living according to a script written by others. They mistake the collective voice for their own inner voice, the external reward system for their own value system, the approval of strangers for the approval of their own deepest self. They become what Jung called provisional personalities, elaborate constructions designed to win love, admiration, and security, but having no authentic relationship to who they actually are. Consider the tragic case of the Soviet Union under Stalin, where the collective expectation became not just a social pressure, but a matter of life and death. Millions of individuals learned to live double lives, presenting a face of perfect communist conformity, while hiding their true thoughts, feelings, and desires so deep that many lost access to them entirely. The poet who wrote propaganda during the day would forget how to access his own authentic voice. The scientist who publicly praised Lysenko's false theories would begin to doubt her own scientific intuition. The ordinary citizen who attended mandatory political rallies would gradually lose the ability to distinguish between genuine enthusiasm and performed loyalty. What emerged was a society of the psychologically dead, people who had become so alienated from their own inner life that they experienced what psychiatrists now recognize as a form of dissociation. They were alive in body, but dead in soul, going through the motions of living while their authentic self remained buried so deep it might as well have been deceased. When the Soviet system finally collapsed, many of these individuals experienced what can only be called an identity crisis of catastrophic proportions. They had lived so long according to external scripts that they had no idea who they were when those scripts were suddenly invalid. The writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who Jung would have recognized as someone who chose the dangerous path of authentic living, described this phenomenon with devastating clarity. We know they are lying. They know they are lying. They know we know they are lying. We know they are lying. But they are still lying. This was not just political commentary, but psychological diagnosis. An entire society had learned to perform life rather than live it. In our contemporary world, the collective expectations are subtler, but no less destructive. We live in what Jung would recognize as a culture of perpetual performance, where social media has turned every individual into a brand, every moment into content, every authentic experience into something to be optimized for external consumption. We curate our lives according to algorithmic preferences, shape our desires according to market research, and measure our worth according to metrics designed by corporations to capture our attention and harvest our data. The modern professional learns to speak in the language of productivity and optimization, gradually losing access to any vocabulary for meaning, purpose, or soul. The modern parent learns to measure success through their children's achievements rather than their children's authentic happiness or their own fulfillment as a human being. The modern individual learns to experience life primarily through the lens of how it will appear to others, creating what Jung would have called a persona, so thick and convincing that it eventually suffocates the person wearing it. Look honestly at your own life and identify the areas where you are living according to scripts written by others rather than choices made by your authentic self. Notice how often you make decisions based on what you think you should want rather than what you actually want. When you imagine changing careers, moving to a different city, or pursuing a long-forgotten dream, pay attention to the voices that immediately arise to explain why such changes are impossible, impractical, or irresponsible. These are often the voices of collective expectation rather than genuine wisdom. Begin to distinguish between the fear that comes from real danger and the fear that comes from social disapproval. Practice making small choices based purely on your own preferences rather than others' expectations, and notice how this feels in your body. This is your authentic self beginning to awaken. The second way we murder our own aliveness is through the construction of what Jung called the persona. The mask we wear in social situations that gradually becomes so convincing we forget we are wearing it. Jung borrowed this term from the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theater, understanding that while personas are necessary for social functioning, they become pathological when we begin to mistake them for our true identity. The persona begins as a survival mechanism, a way of adapting to social demands and winning the approval we need to thrive in human community. The child learns to be charming to avoid punishment, studious to gain praise, compliant to maintain love. These adaptations are not inherently problematic. They represent the healthy human capacity for flexibility and social intelligence. The problem arises when these adapted behaviors become so rigid and comprehensive that they cut us off from our authentic emotional and instinctual life. Jung observed that modern people often become so identified with their personas that they experience what he called persona identification, a psychological condition where the individual believes they are the role they play, rather than understanding the role as one aspect of a much larger and more complex personality. The successful businessman begins to believe that his worth as a human being depends entirely on his professional achievements. The devoted mother begins to believe that her identity is exhausted by her relationship to her children. The spiritual seeker begins to believe that their carefully crafted image of enlightenment represents their actual psychological state. This persona identification creates what Jung recognized as a form of psychological death. The individual becomes a character in a play, rather than a living, breathing, evolving human. They lose access to the full spectrum of human emotion, the full range of human possibility, the full depth of human experience. They become, in Jung's terms, unconscious. Not in the sense of being asleep, but in the sense of having lost conscious contact with the greater part of their own psyche. The most tragic example of persona identification in modern history may be the life of Marilyn Monroe, born Norma Jean Mortensen. Monroe created a persona so compelling, so perfectly crafted to meet the collective fantasies of her era, that it made her one of the most famous women in history. But those who knew her personally described a woman who seemed to disappear when she was not performing, who appeared to have no stable sense of self outside of the character she played for the cameras. Monroe's private writings, discovered after her death, reveal someone desperately searching for her authentic self beneath layers of performed identity. She studied acting with Lee Strasberg, seeking not just professional skill, but psychological truth, a way back to some authentic core that had been buried beneath years of persona construction. She sought therapy, read philosophy, converted to Judaism in a quest for genuine spiritual meaning. But the persona of Marilyn Monroe had become so powerful, so economically and socially valuable, that escaping it required a kind of psychological strength that may have been impossible given the circumstances of her life. Her tragic end can be understood not just as the result of addiction or mental illness, but as the ultimate consequence of what Jung called persona exhaustion. The psychological collapse that occurs when an individual can no longer maintain the energy required to perform their false self. Monroe died not just of an overdose, but of the unbearable tension between who she was expected to be and who she actually was. She became a victim of her own success at creating an identity that the world loved, but that had no authentic relationship to her inner life. In our current era of social media and personal branding, this phenomenon has become almost universal. We live in an age where everyone is expected to be their own publicist, their own marketing department, their own performance artist. Young people learn to curate their online presence before they have had time to discover who they actually are offline. Adults learn to optimize their professional image while losing touch with their actual professional passions. Entire industries exist to help people craft personas that will be more attractive to employers, romantic partners, or social media algorithms. The result is what Jung would have recognized as an epidemic of persona identification. People become so skilled at presenting versions of themselves that meet external demands that they lose access to their authentic preferences, emotions, and desires. They know how to perform happiness, but not how to experience it. They know how to display success, but not how to feel fulfilled. They know how to appear connected, but not how to be intimate. This creates what Jung identified as a particular form of modern suffering. The suffering of the person who has everything they thought they wanted, but feels empty inside. They have successfully built a life that looks perfect from the outside but feels hollow from the inside. They have achieved what their persona was designed to achieve. But in the process, they have lost contact with the part of themselves that could actually enjoy the achievement. Begin to notice the difference between who you are when you are alone and who you are when you are performing for others. Pay attention to the moments when you feel most authentic and alive, and notice whether these moments tend to occur when you are meeting external expectations or when you are following your own inner impulses. Practice spending time in activities that have no external purpose, that cannot be monetized, optimized, or shared on social media. Notice which aspects of your personality you tend to hide or suppress in professional or social situations, and consider whether these hidden aspects might contain important information about your authentic self. Begin to experiment with revealing more of your actual thoughts, feelings, and preferences in safe relationships, and pay attention to how this affects the quality of your connections with others. The third way we murder our own aliveness is through what Jung identified as the trap of provisional life, the psychological condition where we postpone authentic living indefinitely, always waiting for the right conditions, the right timing, the right level of security before we begin to live according to our deepest values and desires. This is perhaps the most insidious form of self-betrayal, because it disguises itself as wisdom, responsibility, and prudent planning. Provisional life operates on the assumption that authentic living is a luxury that can only be afforded once all practical concerns have been addressed. We tell ourselves that we will pursue our true calling once we have enough money saved, once the children are grown, once we have established our career, once we have paid off our debts, once we have found the right partner, once we have achieved some imaginary level of security that will never actually arrive. We treat our authentic desires as hobbies that can be pursued in our spare time, rather than as the organizing principles around which a meaningful life might be built. Jung understood that this provisional approach to living is a defense mechanism against the anxiety of authentic choice. Living according to our deepest values and desires requires us to take responsibility for the direction of our lives in a way that is both exhilarating and terrifying. It means acknowledging that we have more freedom than we usually admit, and that with this freedom comes the responsibility to create meaning rather than simply consume it. The person trapped in provisional life experiences what Jung called a split between their actual life and their potential life. They become experts at imagining how they might live if circumstances were different, while remaining amateurs at living powerfully within their current circumstances. They develop elaborate fantasies about the person they might become, while neglecting the person they are right now. They become tourists in their own existence, always planning for the trip they will take to their authentic life, but never actually purchasing the ticket. This psychological split creates a particular form of depression that Jung recognized as endemic in modern life: the depression of unlived possibility. The individual becomes haunted, not by what has happened to them, but by what has not happened. They carry within themselves a shadow version of their life, a life they might have lived if they had been braver, more trusting of their instincts, more willing to disappoint others in service of honoring themselves. The most poignant example of provisional life in literature may be the character of Ivan Ilyich in Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Ivan spends his entire adult life doing what he believes he is supposed to do, pursuing status, accumulating possessions, maintaining social respectability. He postpones any consideration of what might actually matter to him, assuming that authentic questions about meaning and purpose can be addressed later, when he has more time, more security, more established position in society. Only when faced with terminal illness does Ivan begin to question whether his life has had any genuine meaning. In his final weeks, he realizes that he has lived entirely according to external expectations, while never discovering what he actually valued, desired, or believed. The tragedy is not that he is dying, but that he realizes he has never truly lived. He has spent his entire existence in preparation for a life that never actually began. Tolstoy's genius was in recognizing that Ivan's story is not exceptional but representative. Most people, Jung understood, live some version of provisional life, treating their current existence as a dress rehearsal for a more authentic existence that will begin at some indefinite future point. They experience their present circumstances as obstacles to overcome, rather than as the raw material from which a meaningful life might be constructed. In our contemporary world, provisional life has been institutionalized through what we might call the preparation economy, an entire system built around the idea that life is a series of stages that must be completed before authentic living can begin. We prepare for college, then college prepares us for career, then early career prepares us for advanced career, then advanced career prepares us for retirement, then retirement prepares us for what? We have created a culture where preparation for living has replaced actual living. Young people are encouraged to optimize their resumes rather than explore their passions. Adults are encouraged to focus on advancement rather than fulfillment. Older people are encouraged to prepare for retirement rather than consider what kind of legacy they want to. At every stage, the message is the same. Authentic living is a luxury that can be afforded only after more pressing concerns have been addressed. But those pressing concerns multiply rather than diminish, and the provisional life stretches indefinitely into the future. This creates what Jung would have recognized as a form of chronic anxiety, the anxiety of the person who senses that time is passing, but feels unable to begin actually living. They are haunted by the gap between their current existence and their potential existence, but they feel trapped by circumstances that seem to make authentic choice impossible. They develop elaborate rationalizations for why they cannot pursue their deeper interests, but these rationalizations often mask a deeper fear of taking responsibility for their own fulfillment. The most tragic aspect of provisional life is that it tends to become self-perpetuating. The longer we postpone authentic living, the more we convince ourselves that it is impossible. The skills required for authentic choice, the ability to tolerate uncertainty, to trust our own judgment, to disappoint others when necessary, atrophy from lack of use. We become increasingly dependent on external validation and external structure, making the leap to authentic living seem more and more impossible. Identify the areas of your life where you are waiting for better conditions before you begin living according to your deeper values and desires. Notice the stories you tell yourself about why authentic choice is impossible right now. And consider whether these stories are based on genuine practical constraints or on fear of taking responsibility for your own fulfillment. Begin to make small choices that honor your authentic preferences within your current circumstances, rather than waiting for circumstances to change. Practice thinking of your current life as your actual life, rather than as preparation for your future life. Consider what you would do differently if you knew that your current circumstances were permanent, and notice whether any of those changes might be possible right now. The fourth and most devastating way we murder our own aliveness is through what Jung identified as the terror of psychological death. The unconscious recognition that authentic living requires the death of our familiar, false self, and our desperate attempts to avoid this necessary transformation. This is the deepest layer of our fear of unlived life. We intuitively understand that becoming who we really are requires killing off who we think we are, and this psychological death feels as threatening as physical death. Jung understood that psychological transformation is always a death and rebirth process. The caterpillar must completely dissolve in the chrysalis before the butterfly can emerge. The person we have been, with all their familiar patterns, defenses, and identity structures, must undergo a kind of death before the person we might become can be born. But unlike the caterpillar, human beings are conscious of this process, and consciousness makes the death terrifying even when it is necessary for our growth. This terror of psychological death manifests as an unconscious commitment to staying stuck in patterns that no longer serve us, but feel safe because they are familiar. We choose the misery we know over the happiness we don't know. We remain in relationships that drain us rather than risk the uncertainty of being alone. We stay in careers that bore us rather than face the anxiety of discovering what we might actually love to do. We maintain versions of ourselves that feel increasingly false, rather than undergo the disorientation of discovering who we might actually be. Jung recognized that this fear of psychological death is often disguised as practical concerns, moral obligations, or logical reasoning. We convince ourselves that we stay in unsatisfying situations because we are being responsible, realistic, or loyal. But underneath these rational explanations lies a deeper terror, the terror of losing our familiar sense of self, even when that familiar self is a prison. This terror is particularly acute in midlife, which Jung understood as the natural time for psychological death and rebirth. The person who has successfully built an adult identity based on external achievements and social expectations begins to sense that this identity, while functional, is not authentic. They feel called to a deeper level of living, but this call requires them to question everything they have built their life around. The successful professional begins to wonder whether their career has any real meaning. The devoted parent begins to wonder who they are apart from their relationship to their children. The responsible adult begins to wonder what they might have become if they had been willing to take more risks. This midlife psychological death and rebirth process is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who we actually are rather than who we think we should be. But individuation is terrifying because it requires us to let go of our familiar identity structures without any guarantee of what will replace them. It requires a leap of faith into the unknown aspects of ourselves, trusting that there is something authentic waiting to be discovered beneath the layers of adaptation and performance. The most powerful example of someone who chose psychological death over spiritual death may be the Buddha, whose given name was Siddhartha Gautama. Born into a life of privilege and luxury, with every external condition for happiness already in place, Siddhartha nonetheless felt haunted by the possibility that his comfortable existence was a form of unconscious sleepwalking. Despite having a loving wife, a newborn child, and a position of power and respect, he felt called to something deeper and more authentic. The Buddha's great going forth, his decision to leave his palace and seek enlightenment, can be understood as a conscious choice of psychological death. He willingly destroyed the identity of prince, husband, and father in order to discover what lay beneath these social roles. This was not an escape from responsibility, but a movement toward a deeper kind of responsibility. Responsibility to his own authentic nature, and to the possibility of awakening that he sensed within himself. The years of seeking that followed were a sustained process of psychological dying. The Buddha experimented with extreme asceticism, nearly dying physically in his attempt to kill off the ego self that he recognized as the source of suffering. When this approach proved inadequate, he chose what he called the middle way, a path that required neither indulgence nor self-torture, but rather a kind of conscious surrender to the process of transformation. The moment of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree can be understood as the completion of his psychological death and the birth of an entirely new kind of consciousness. The person who sat down under that tree was not the same person who stood up. Siddhartha Gautama had died, and the Buddha had been born. This was not metaphorical language, but literal description, a complete transformation of identity, perception, and relationship to existence. What makes the Buddha's story so relevant to Jung's insight about the fear of unlived life is that this transformation required him to choose uncertainty over security, authenticity over conformity, psychological truth over social comfort. He had to be willing to disappoint everyone who had expectations of him: his father, his wife, his child, his entire society, in order to honor what he felt calling him toward a deeper kind of living. In our contemporary world, we have largely lost any cultural support for this kind of conscious psychological death and rebirth. We have therapeutic models for healing trauma and psychiatric models for treating mental illness, but we have few frameworks for supporting the kind of voluntary ego death that authentic transformation requires. We tend to pathologize the psychological disorientation that accompanies individuation, treating it as a problem to be solved rather than as a natural part of human development. This leaves most people trapped in what Jung would have called unconscious provisional life, sensing that transformation is needed but lacking any guidance for how to navigate the death and rebirth process safely. They feel called to change, but terrified of the uncertainty that change requires. They sense that their current identity is too small for who they might become, but they cannot imagine who they would be without that familiar identity. The result is what Jung identified as a form of chronic low-level depression. The depression of the person who is dying psychologically but not being reborn. They feel increasingly alienated from their own life, but cannot imagine how to create a different life. They experience their existence as increasingly meaningless, but cannot access the courage required to risk everything in pursuit of authentic meaning. Notice the areas of your life where you feel called to change, but find yourself paralyzed by fear of losing your familiar sense of identity. Pay attention to the ways you might be choosing familiar misery over unfamiliar possibility. Consider what aspects of your current identity might need to die in order for your authentic self to be born. Practice tolerating small amounts of uncertainty and disorientation as preparation for larger transformations. Begin to distinguish between the fear that protects you from genuine danger and the fear that protects you from growth and aliveness. So far, we have excavated the 4 ways we murder our own aliveness, through unconscious submission to collective expectations that turn us into performers rather than authentic beings, through identification with personas that become prisons for our true nature, through the trap of provisional life that postpones authentic living indefinitely, and through terror of the psychological death that authentic transformation requires. But recognizing these patterns of self-betrayal is only the beginning of Jung's radical psychology. Now we enter the territory that Jung called individuation, the heroic journey toward becoming who we actually are rather than who we think we should be. This is not self-improvement, but self-discovery, not optimization, but transformation, not healing, but wholeness. The path ahead requires not just understanding, but courage, not just insight, but action, not just knowledge, but the willingness to be wounded in service of becoming whole. Jung called this the most important work a human being can undertake, and the most dangerous. For in choosing to become authentic, we risk everything we thought we knew about ourselves and everything others expect us to be. But in that risk lies the only possibility for a life that, when death finally comes, we can recognize as having been truly lived. True strength lies not in avoiding our darkness, but in consciously integrating it. Jung's most revolutionary insight was his recognition that every human personality contains what he called the shadow, the collection of qualities, impulses, and potentials that we have rejected, denied, or hidden from consciousness, because they conflict with our idealized self-image or social expectations. The shadow is not evil, but it is everything we believe we are not. Everything we have decided is unacceptable about human nature. Everything we have split off from our conscious identity in our attempt to be good, successful, or lovable. Most people spend enormous psychological energy trying to maintain the illusion that they do not possess the qualities that make up their shadow. They project these qualities onto others, seeing in enemies and outsiders the very characteristics they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. They live in a state of what Jung called unconscious inflation, believing themselves to be better, purer, more evolved than they actually are, while remaining blind to the parts of themselves that contradict this idealized self-image. But Jung understood that this splitting of the personality comes at an enormous cost. When we reject parts of ourselves, we lose access not only to the destructive potential of those parts, but also to their creative and generative power. The person who cannot acknowledge their capacity for aggression also cannot access their capacity for fierce protection of what they love. The individual who cannot accept their selfishness also cannot access their healthy self-regard and boundary setting. The personality that denies its darkness also cuts itself off from the earthy, instinctual vitality that gives life its juice and power. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires what he called shadow work, the conscious integration of our rejected aspects rather than their continued repression. This is not about acting out destructive impulses, but about acknowledging them consciously so that they can be transformed and channeled rather than remaining unconscious and therefore potentially dangerous. Jung understood that the shadow often contains not just our worst qualities, but also our greatest unlived potential. In our attempts to conform to social expectations or family values, we often reject aspects of ourselves that are actually sources of creativity, passion, and authentic power. The good girl who has rejected her rebellious nature may have also rejected her capacity for innovation and leadership. The responsible man who has denied his spontaneous, playful side may have also denied his capacity for joy and creative risk-taking. The most powerful example of conscious shadow integration in modern history may be the transformation of Malcolm X during his pilgrimage to Mecca. Malcolm had built his identity as a black Muslim leader around a fierce rejection of white society and an equally fierce embrace of black separatism. His shadow, the parts of himself he had rejected, included any capacity for cooperation, forgiveness, or integration across racial lines. But during his Hajj, Malcolm encountered white Muslims who treated him with genuine respect and brotherhood. This experience forced him to confront the shadow of his own belief system, the possibility that his commitment to separation was based not just on political analysis, but also on unprocessed rage and trauma. Rather than rejecting this recognition or doubling down on his previous position, Malcolm chose the difficult path of shadow integration. In his letters from Mecca, Malcolm wrote about his growing recognition that his previous worldview, while understandable given his experiences, had become too rigid to contain the fullness of his humanity or the complexity of the world he was trying to change. He began to acknowledge the parts of himself that were capable of forgiveness, cooperation, and even love toward people he had previously seen only as enemies. This shadow integration required Malcolm to undergo a kind of psychological death. The identity he had built as a separatist leader had to die in order for a more complex, more integrated personality to be born. This was not about becoming softer or abandoning his commitment to justice, but about accessing a fuller range of his human capacities in service of his deepest values. Tragically, Malcolm was assassinated shortly after beginning this integration process. But his final speeches reveal a man who had found a way to honor both his fierce commitment to Black liberation and his growing recognition of shared humanity. He had discovered what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold seemingly contradictory aspects of experience in conscious tension, rather than splitting them into rigid categories of good and bad. In our contemporary world, shadow work has become more necessary and more difficult than ever. We live in a culture of extreme polarization, where people are encouraged to identify completely with one side of every issue, and to see those who disagree as fundamentally different and dangerous. This creates what Jung would have recognized as collective shadow projection, entire groups of people splitting off their own capacity for the qualities they despise in their political or cultural opponents. The progressive, who cannot acknowledge their own capacity for judgment and exclusion, projects these qualities onto conservatives, seeing them as inherently bigoted while remaining blind to their own forms of prejudice. The conservative, who cannot acknowledge their own capacity for privilege and selfishness, projects these qualities onto progressives, seeing them as inherently entitled while remaining unconscious of their own sense of entitlement. Both sides remain locked in what Jung called unconscious identification with their idealized self-image while projecting their shadow onto the other. This collective shadow projection makes genuine dialogue impossible and keeps both individuals and society trapped in cycles of reactivity and mutual demonization. But more importantly for our purposes, it keeps individuals trapped in incomplete versions of themselves, cut off from the full range of their human capacities. The path of conscious shadow integration requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to see ourselves as we actually are, rather than as we wish we were. This means acknowledging our capacity for selfishness, cruelty, prejudice, and destructiveness, not in order to act on these capacities, but in order to take conscious responsibility for them. It means recognizing that we are capable of the very things we criticize in others, and that this recognition is the beginning of genuine wisdom and compassion. Begin to notice the qualities you most strongly judge or criticize in other people, and consider the possibility that these qualities exist in some form within yourself. Pay attention to your emotional reactions to news stories, political figures, or social media posts, and ask yourself what these reactions might reveal about your own disowned aspects. Practice acknowledging your less flattering motivations and impulses without immediately trying to fix or change them. Simply bringing them into consciousness is the first step of integration. Notice the areas where you feel most righteous or superior, and consider what shadow material might be hiding beneath these feelings of moral certainty. The conscious mind is like the tip of an iceberg, while the unconscious contains vast territories of wisdom, creativity, and guidance that most people never learn to access. Jung's second path to authentic living involves what he called active imagination, a practice of conscious dialogue with the unconscious mind that opens doorways to psychological resources we never knew we possessed. Unlike passive fantasy or daydreaming, active imagination is a disciplined practice of engaging with the spontaneous images, symbols, and narratives that arise from the unconscious. Jung discovered this practice during his own psychological crisis, when he began what he called his experiments with the unconscious, deliberately entering into dialogue with the figures and forces that appeared in his dreams. Jung understood that the unconscious is not simply a repository of repressed memories or primitive instincts, but a creative and intelligent system that contains what he called prospective information, guidance about who we might become and what we might create. The unconscious, in Jung's understanding, is constantly working on the problems of our life, generating solutions, insights, and creative possibilities that our rational mind could never develop on its own. But accessing this unconscious intelligence requires learning a different kind of language, the language of symbols, images, and metaphors, rather than the language of logic and analysis. It requires developing what Jung called symbolic attitude, the capacity to treat the spontaneous productions of the unconscious as meaningful communications, rather than as random neural activity or wish fulfillment. Active imagination involves entering into a kind of waking dream state where we allow images and scenarios to emerge spontaneously, then engage with them as if they were real encounters with autonomous beings. This might involve having conversations with dream figures, imagining ourselves in symbolic landscapes, or allowing stories to unfold that seem to have their own logic and direction. The key insight of active imagination is that these encounters are not just products of our personal psychology, but connections to what Jung called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of psyche that contains the accumulated wisdom of human experience across cultures and centuries. Through active imagination, we can access what Jung called archetypal guidance, the universal patterns and energies that have guided human development since the beginning of consciousness. One of the most powerful examples of active imagination in creative work is the experience of authors who describe their characters as becoming autonomous, taking on a life of their own and making choices that surprise their creators. J.K. Rowling has described how Harry Potter and other characters in her novels would sometimes refuse to follow the plot she had planned, insisting on different developments that turned out to be more compelling than her original idea. This is not simply a metaphorical way of describing the creative process, but an actual psychological phenomenon where the unconscious mind generates creative solutions that are more intelligent and integrated than anything the conscious mind could devise. Rowling was practicing a form of active imagination, allowing her unconscious to participate actively in the creation of her fictional world. Similarly, the mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan claimed that his revolutionary mathematical insights came to him in dreams, where a Hindu goddess would show him mathematical formulas that he would then verify through conscious calculation. Ramanujan was accessing what Jung would have recognized as archetypal intelligence, a level of knowing that transcends personal learning and connects to universal patterns of order and creativity. The scientist Kekulé discovered the ring structure of benzene through a dream of a snake eating its own tail, an ancient symbol that Jung called the Ouroboros, representing cycles of death and renewal. Kekulé's unconscious mind solved a problem that had stumped the scientific community by presenting the solution in symbolic form, requiring him to translate the image into chemical terms. These examples illustrate Jung's insight that the unconscious is not simply a personal repository, but a creative intelligence that can provide guidance, solutions, and insights that surpass the limitations of rational thinking. But accessing this intelligence requires developing a relationship with the unconscious, rather than simply trying to control it through will and logic. In our hyper-rational, technology-saturated culture, most people have lost the capacity for active imagination. We have been trained to value only information that can be verified externally, and to dismiss inner experiences as subjective and therefore unreliable. We have sophisticated technologies for processing external data, but primitive technologies for accessing internal wisdom. This creates what Jung would have recognized as a form of psychological malnutrition. We feed our minds constantly with external information while starving our souls of the symbolic nourishment that can only come from within. We become experts at consuming other people's creativity, while remaining amateurs at accessing our own creative source. The result is what Jung called spiritual poverty, a condition where people have access to more information than any generation in history, but feel increasingly disconnected from wisdom, meaning, and creative inspiration. They know how to Google answers to factual questions, but have no idea how to access guidance for the deeper questions of how to live, what to create, or who to become. Active imagination offers a pathway back to this lost capacity for inner guidance. But it requires what Jung called sacrifice of the rational attitude, the willingness to temporarily suspend our need to understand everything logically, and to engage with experiences that cannot be easily categorized or explained. This practice might begin simply with paying attention to dreams and allowing them to influence our waking life decisions. It might involve setting aside time for unstructured reflection, allowing thoughts and images to arise without immediately analyzing or judging them. It might include creative practices like drawing, writing, or movement that bypass rational control and allow unconscious material to emerge. The key is developing what Jung called symbolic attitude, the capacity to treat inner experiences as meaningful communications rather than as random neural activity. This requires learning to think symbolically rather than literally, to ask what an image or experience might mean rather than whether it is factually accurate. Set aside regular time for unstructured inner reflection, allowing thoughts, images, and impressions to arise without immediately analyzing or judging them. Begin paying attention to your dreams and asking what guidance they might contain, rather than trying to interpret them literally. Experiment with creative practices that bypass rational control. Automatic writing, drawing with your non-dominant hand, or movement that follows impulse rather than choreography. When facing difficult decisions, try imagining different possible futures and notice which scenarios feel most alive and energizing, rather than simply most logical or practical. Every human being carries within themselves what Jung called the daimon, an inner voice or guiding spirit that knows their unique purpose and calling in life. This is not a mystical concept, but a psychological reality. The aspect of our personality that contains our deepest values, our authentic desires, and our unique contribution to the world. The daimon is what calls us toward experiences that feel meaningful, relationships that feel nourishing, and work that feels like expression rather than mere survival. But in our culture of external achievement and social conformity, most people learn to ignore or override their daemon in favor of more practical considerations. We are taught to choose careers based on market demand rather than inner calling, to pursue relationships that look good on paper rather than those that feel alive, to make decisions based on what others expect rather than what our deepest self knows to be true. Jung understood that ignoring the daemon is not just personally costly but spiritually deadly. When we live in opposition to our inner calling, we experience what he described as a form of soul sickness, a chronic sense of meaninglessness, depression, and alienation that no amount of external success can cure. We become strangers to ourselves, experts at meeting others' expectations while remaining amateurs at honoring our own deepest knowing. The daemon speaks through what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to guide us toward experiences and opportunities that serve our authentic development. It speaks through our spontaneous interests and fascinations, the subjects and activities that capture our attention without effort. It speaks through our embodied responses to different life choices, the sense of energy and aliveness we feel when moving toward authentic expressions of ourselves, and the sense of depletion and deadness we feel when moving away from them. But learning to hear and follow the daimon requires developing what Jung called the courage of one's own authenticity, the willingness to trust our inner guidance, even when it conflicts with external expectations or practical considerations. This is not about being impulsive or irresponsible, but about developing the discernment to distinguish between the voice of authentic calling and the voices of fear, ego, or social conditioning. One of the most powerful examples of someone who followed their daemon despite enormous external pressure to conform was the physicist Albert Einstein. From childhood, Einstein felt called to understand the fundamental nature of reality, despite having no obvious practical gifts or academic credentials that suggested success in physics. His early academic performance was mediocre, his social skills were limited, and his family expected him to pursue a more practical career. But Einstein possessed what Jung would have recognized as an unshakable connection to his daimon, an inner knowing that his authentic calling was to penetrate the mysteries of space, time, and matter. He pursued this calling with a kind of spiritual devotion, spending years working as a patent clerk while developing the theories that would revolutionize physics during his spare time. Einstein's willingness to follow his daemon required him to endure years of poverty, social isolation, and professional rejection. His revolutionary ideas were initially dismissed by the scientific establishment, and he faced enormous pressure to abandon his theoretical work in favor of more practical pursuits. But he possessed what Jung called fidelity to one's daemon, the capacity to remain loyal to inner calling despite external opposition. When Einstein's theories were finally validated and he achieved international recognition, he did not experience this success as vindication of his practical choices, but as confirmation of his spiritual alignment. He had followed what felt most alive and authentic within himself, trusting that this alignment would ultimately serve not just his personal fulfillment, but the larger purposes of knowledge and human understanding. Einstein's later years were devoted to what many considered a futile quest for a theory of everything that would unite quantum mechanics and general relativity. From a practical standpoint, this work was unsuccessful and probably damaged his scientific reputation. But from the standpoint of following one's daemon, it represented perfect integrity, the willingness to pursue what felt most meaningful rather than what promised the greatest external reward. Einstein understood intuitively what Jung articulated psychologically. that following our authentic calling is not just personally fulfilling, but serves some larger intelligence or purpose that we cannot fully understand with our rational minds. When we align with our daimon, we become instruments of whatever creative force is seeking to express itself through human consciousness. In our contemporary world, the ability to hear and follow our daimon has been systematically undermined by what we might call the optimization culture. The belief that life decisions should be made based on data analysis, market research, and strategic planning, rather than inner guidance and authentic attraction. Young people are encouraged to choose majors based on earning potential rather than fascination. Adults are encouraged to make career moves based on advancement opportunities rather than alignment with their deepest values. This optimization approach to life creates what Jung would have recognized as a form of spiritual schizophrenia, a split between our outer strategic self and our inner authentic self. We become experts at analyzing external opportunities while remaining ignorant of our internal compass. We develop sophisticated skills for meeting market demands, while losing touch with our soul's demands. The result is what Jung called the unlived life, the haunting sense that we are living someone else's script rather than writing our own story. We achieve external markers of success while feeling internally empty. We meet others' expectations while disappointing our deepest self. We become successful performers of a life rather than authentic livers of our own unique existence. But reconnecting with our daimon is possible at any stage of life. It requires what Jung called turning inward, developing the capacity to distinguish between the voice of authentic calling and the voices of fear, conditioning, and external pressure. It requires learning to pay attention to our embodied responses to different life choices, noticing what energizes us and what depletes us, what feels like authentic expression and what feels like performance. Most importantly, following our daimon requires what Jung called the courage of individuation, the willingness to disappoint others when necessary in order to honor our authentic calling. This is not about being selfish or irresponsible, but about recognizing that our ultimate responsibility is to become who we actually are, rather than who others expect us to be. Pay attention to the activities, subjects, and experiences that capture your interest effortlessly, without force or external motivation. These often point toward your authentic calling. Notice the times when you feel most energized and alive, and consider what these experiences have in common. Practice distinguishing between choices that look good strategically and choices that feel right in your body and soul. When facing major life decisions, spend time in silence or in nature, allowing your deeper knowing to emerge before consulting external advisors or making logical analyses. Begin to experiment with small choices that honor your authentic preferences rather than external expectations, and notice how these choices affect your overall sense of vitality and meaning. The final and most challenging path to authentic living is what Jung called the willingness to undergo creative suffering. The recognition that becoming whole often requires experiencing the wounds that our defensive patterns have been designed to avoid. This is not masochistic self-punishment, but the mature understanding that some kinds of psychological pain are not problems to be solved, but experiences to be undergone in service of growth and authenticity. Jung distinguished between what he called neurotic suffering, the repetitive pain that comes from being trapped in unconscious patterns, and creative suffering, the acute but transformative pain that comes from choosing growth over security, authenticity over comfort, truth over illusion. Neurotic suffering keeps us stuck in familiar misery. Creative suffering liberates us into unfamiliar possibility. Most people spend enormous energy trying to avoid any form of psychological discomfort, constructing elaborate defenses against anxiety, disappointment, rejection, and loss. But Jung understood that these defenses, while protecting us from immediate pain, also protect us from the experiences that could transform us. We become so skilled at avoiding suffering that we also avoid living. Creative suffering involves the willingness to choose experiences that stretch us beyond our comfort zone, because they serve our authentic development, even when this means tolerating anxiety, uncertainty, or temporary pain. It means choosing to have difficult conversations that could deepen our relationships, rather than maintaining superficial peace. It means pursuing work that feels meaningful even when it involves financial risk or social disapproval. It means allowing ourselves to grieve losses fully, rather than immediately trying to move on or find silver linings. This willingness to embrace creative suffering is what Jung called the capacity for sacrifice. Not the sacrifice of our authentic self to others' expectations, but the sacrifice of our defensive patterns to our growth, our familiar comfort to our evolution, our small safe life to our larger possible life. The most profound example of someone who chose creative suffering in service of authentic living may be the South African leader Nelson Mandela. When Mandela chose to actively resist apartheid, he knew that this choice would likely result in imprisonment, separation from his family, and possibly death. From the standpoint of avoiding suffering, his choice made no sense. He could have lived a comfortable life as a lawyer, avoiding political involvement and maintaining his personal security. But Mandela possessed what Jung would have recognized as a deep connection to his authentic calling, the inner knowing that his life was meant to serve something larger than his personal comfort or safety. His willingness to undergo creative suffering was not masochistic, but strategic. He understood intuitively that some forms of external suffering were necessary to avoid the much deeper suffering of living an inauthentic life. During his 27 years in prison, Mandela continued to choose creative suffering over defensive comfort. Rather than becoming bitter or hardened by his imprisonment, he used the experience as an opportunity for deep psychological work. He studied his captors, learning to understand their psychology and motivations. He practiced forgiveness not as a moral ideal, but as a practical tool for transformation. He maintained his vision of a post-apartheid South Africa, not as naive optimism, but as creative imagination. Most remarkably, Mandela emerged from prison not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a healer seeking reconciliation. His willingness to undergo creative suffering had transformed him from a young revolutionary into what Jung would have called an individuated leader, someone who had integrated his shadow, accessed his deeper wisdom, and aligned with his authentic purpose. Mandela's choice to forgive his oppressors and work toward reconciliation rather than revolution was another act of creative suffering. It would have been emotionally easier and politically simpler to pursue revenge against the apartheid system. But Mandela understood that his country's healing required someone willing to absorb the pain of transition, rather than perpetuating cycles of retaliation. This capacity for creative suffering allowed Mandela to become what Jung called a wounded healer. Someone whose willingness to be wounded in service of truth created the possibility for collective healing. His personal transformation through suffering became a model for his country's transformation, demonstrating that it is possible to choose growth over revenge, healing over bitterness, integration over division. In our contemporary culture of therapeutic comfort and chemical convenience, we have largely lost the understanding that some suffering is creative and necessary, rather than pathological and to be avoided. We have medications for anxiety, techniques for managing depression, and endless strategies for avoiding discomfort. While these tools can be valuable for genuine mental health issues, they can also become ways of avoiding the creative suffering that authentic growth requires. We live in what Jung would have called a comfort culture, a society that treats any form of psychological discomfort as a problem to be solved, rather than as potential information about needed changes in our lives. We are encouraged to medicate anxiety, rather than ask what the anxiety might be trying to tell us. We are taught to manage depression, rather than consider whether our depression might be a natural response to living an inauthentic life. This cultural avoidance of creative suffering creates what Jung recognized as spiritual infantilism, the psychological condition of adults who have never learned to tolerate discomfort in service of growth. They remain dependent on external sources of validation, comfort, and meaning, because they have never developed the internal resources that come from choosing growth over security. The result is what Jung called the provisional life, taken to its logical extreme. People who spend their entire existence trying to avoid the very experiences that could liberate them into authentic living. They become experts at comfort management while remaining amateurs at personal transformation. They develop sophisticated strategies for avoiding pain while never developing the capacity to transform pain into wisdom. But creative suffering is not about seeking pain for its own sake or romanticizing hardship. It is about developing what Jung called the capacity for conscious sacrifice, the mature ability to choose temporary discomfort in service of long-term authenticity and growth. It is about learning to distinguish between suffering that serves our development and suffering that merely repeats familiar patterns. Creative suffering requires what Jung called the religious attitude, not adherence to any particular religious doctrine, but the recognition that our individual life is part of some larger meaning or purpose that we serve by becoming fully ourselves. When we understand our personal growth as serving something beyond our immediate comfort, we can find the courage to undergo the transformations that authentic living requires. Notice the areas of your life where you automatically avoid discomfort and consider whether this avoidance might be keeping you from growth opportunities. Practice distinguishing between suffering that serves your development and suffering that merely repeats familiar patterns. When facing difficult choices, ask yourself whether you are choosing based on avoiding pain or based on moving toward authenticity and growth. Begin to develop tolerance for uncertainty, anxiety, and temporary discomfort as natural parts of any meaningful change process. Consider what you might be willing to sacrifice in terms of comfort, security, or approval in order to live more authentically. We have completed a profound journey through the landscape of unlived life and authentic existence. We began by excavating the 4 ways we murder our own aliveness, through unconscious submission to collective expectations that transform us into performers of other people's scripts, through identification with personas that become psychological prisons, through the trap of provisional life that postpones authentic living indefinitely, and through terror of the psychological death that transformation requires. Then we explored Jung's 4 paths to individuation, the heroic journey toward authentic selfhood, the courage to confront and integrate our shadow rather than projecting it onto others, the discipline of active imagination that opens gateways to unconscious wisdom, the practice of following our daemon, the inner voice that knows our unique calling, and the willingness to undergo creative suffering in service of growth and wholeness. These 8 insights form what Jung understood as a complete psychology of authentic living. The first 4 reveal how we betray ourselves through unconscious conformity to external demands. The last 4 show how we can reclaim ourselves through conscious alignment with internal truth. Together, they offer a pathway from what Jung called the provisional life to what he termed the realized life, existence that honors both our individual authenticity and our connection to something larger than ourselves. But this knowledge comes with what Jung recognized as a terrible responsibility. To understand the difference between authentic living and performance of living means that ignorance is no longer available as an excuse. To recognize the ways we betray our own deepest nature means we can no longer claim that we had no choice. To see the possibility of transformation means we must either embrace it or consciously reject it. Neutrality is no longer possible. Use this understanding to examine your own life with uncompromising honesty. Use it to distinguish between the choices that serve your authentic development and the choices that merely maintain comfortable familiarity. Use it to recognize the difference between the fear that protects you from genuine danger and the fear that protects you from growth and aliveness. But never use this knowledge as a weapon against others or as a source of judgment about those who choose differently. The path of individuation is not a moral imperative, but a personal calling. Not everyone is meant to become conscious in the same way or at the same time. Some people serve the collective good by maintaining stability and tradition. Others serve by pioneering new possibilities and challenging existing patterns. Remember that the goal of authentic living is not to become perfect or enlightened, but to become real. We undertake the journey of individuation not to transcend our humanity, but to embrace it more fully. We learn to integrate our shadow, not to become saints, but to become whole. We follow our daemon not to achieve some ultimate spiritual state, but to honor the unique gift we came here to give. The choice, as Jung knew, is always ours. We can continue to live what he called the statistical life, the life of average expectations and collective conformity, or we can undertake what he termed the individual life, the dangerous and exhilarating journey toward becoming who we actually are. The first path offers the comfort of belonging, but the cost of authenticity. The second path offers the possibility of meaning, but the price of uncertainty. Most people, Jung observed, choose the statistical life because the individual life requires too much courage, too much responsibility, too much willingness to stand alone. But for those who hear the call to authentic living, no other choice is ultimately possible. They may delay, they may resist, they may find elaborate ways to avoid the journey, but the call continues until it is answered, or until death makes the choice irrelevant. In the comments below, share which of these 8 insights challenges you most directly. Is it the recognition of how much you live according to others' expectations, rather than your own authentic values? Is it the understanding that your persona may have become a prison? Is it the realization that you have been living provisionally, waiting for permission to begin your real life? Or is it the call to undergo the psychological death that authentic transformation requires? Your honest engagement with these questions is itself an act of individuation, a step toward the life that is uniquely yours to live. If this exploration of Jung's psychology of authentic living resonates with your deepest knowing about what life could be, then subscribe to this channel. We dive into the most transformative ideas from psychology, philosophy, and spirituality. Ideas that can awaken you to possibilities you may not have known existed within you. And if you found value in this journey through Jung's understanding of unlived life, give this video a like. Your engagement helps these ideas reach others who may be ready to move from performance to authenticity, from provisional living to realized existence, from the fear of death to the fear of never having truly lived. You do not fear death. You fear an unlived life. The question that remains is, what will you do with this knowledge?